Hi, I'm Dave Rosen, and today I'd like to tell you about some studies we did with two young trained walruses here in Vancouver, Canada. These investigations were designed to help scientists forecast how this species may be impacted by global climate change in the wild. A more concise title for this talk would be the question, what does it take to power a walrus? Walruses are an ice-dependent Arctic species. Females and the young are particularly reliant on the presence of stable ice platforms for hauling out and resting. Walrus are also central place foragers, and they rely on the presence of ice over the continental shelf where their primary feeding grounds are. This minimizes travel time and costs when foraging. We all know that the Arctic is undergoing a startling environmental transformation due to climate change. Global warming results in the edge of the ice shelf being further from these feeding grounds, increasing both the distance traveled and the amount of time spent in the water. But so what? How much of a burden is this to individual animals? Bioenergetic models can be used to predict how much food or energy an animal requires under various conditions. Typically, the end product of these models will be a graph that illustrates how daily energy requirements, shown here on the y-axis, changes with the age of the animal or time of year, depending on the question. These models are essentially a mathematical representation of all of the various energetic costs that contribute to an animal's total energy budget. One of the primary components of an animal's energy budget is its resting metabolic rate. This is a basic measure of the cost of existence, and it's a well-known way to compare different animals under standard physiological conditions. It's also foundational to many bioenergetic models, in the sense that measures of resting metabolism are often used to estimate other components of the energy budget. As a result, the effects of any errors in estimates of resting metabolism will be multiplied throughout the entire model. The cost of locomotion is also important, as it's typically the greatest voluntary cost of an animal's energy budget. Knowing the cost of movement is critical for estimating the energetic consequences of observed behavioral changes in the wild. Also, because locomotor costs are frequently tied to foraging effort, there's a sort of circular relationship between environmental changes and locomotor costs. There are some excellent published bioenergetic models of walruses. However, any model is only as good as the data used as inputs. Optimally, you want to use species-specific data collected from wild individuals, but this isn't always possible. For example, researchers often have to extrapolate data from other species that they perceive are closely related to the species of interest. Animals under managed care in zoos and aquariums provide an alternate but valuable source for obtaining empirical data under controlled laboratory conditions. Our studies used two young walruses that were on loan to the Vancouver Aquarium from the Aquarium du Quebec, where they were born. The male and female calves arrived when they were about 18 months old, and the studies I'll discuss today took place when they were between 2.5 and 3.5 years old. Specifically, and as you probably guessed from my introduction, we measured both resting metabolic rate and the cost of swimming in these walruses using standard gas respirometry, which, simply put, measures the amount of oxygen consumed and carbon dioxide produced while the animals are engaged in these various activities. Here's the male walrus in one of the training sessions for our resting metabolism trials. Resting metabolic rate was measured by having the walruses station quietly at the edge of their pool underneath a floating respirometry dome that was connected to Sable system gas analysis components. The animals are trained for 3 months to remain totally calm and to perform this behavior with minimal food reinforcement. We measured resting metabolism every other week for 13 months in order to track potential developmental or seasonal effects. Despite the importance of the cost of activity to total energy requirements, very few direct measures of the cost of swimming have been undertaken with marine mammals. This is mostly because, well, it's very difficult to accomplish, even with trained animals in the lab. Most studies have measured the cost of diving, which is physiologically different. Our approach was to train the walrus to swim underwater laps, as seen in this early training video. They had to complete 3 laps, each about 37 meters, or about 120 feet. And the trick is they had to do this without breathing at the surface. And then they had to return to the floating metabolic dome and remain there for an additional 10 minutes. Some rudimentary math allowed us to differentiate the additional costs that the animals had to expend in order to swim the 110 meters, which is basically the length of an American football field. This is the data from the resting metabolic rate trials. Energy expenditure is expressed on a mass-specific basis over the 13-month study for both the female walrus, shown as red circles, and the male walrus, shown as blue triangles. Of course, for most of you, this will be completely meaningless. This is the metabolic data for the walruses, this time graphed as rate of absolute energy consumption versus body mass, and compared to data for 8 other species of marine mammals. The walrus data is the colored dots. At first glance, it might seem that the resting metabolism of the walrus is comparable with other marine mammals. But the truth is, I cheated. In fact, the other data are from adult marine mammals. Young animals, including marine mammals, typically have higher metabolic rates for their size because of their higher costs of growth. Unfortunately, there isn't a lot of data available for juvenile marine mammals except for very young pinniped pups in order to make a direct comparison. Usually it's safe to assume that metabolism of young animals is 2 to 3 times that of adults, as was incorporated into previous walrus bioenergetic models. But our results suggest that the resting metabolic rate of young walrus are much lower than would be predicted from other marine mammals, and therefore these models may overestimate total food requirements. During the last 2 months of their visit, we were able to repeatedly measure the swimming metabolic rate of the walruses. Now, there are a number of ways to express the cost of swimming. In this figure, it's represented as the total cost of transport, which is the gross energy required to move 1 kilogram of walrus 1 meter. This measure controls for differences in body size and swimming speed between animals, and is most readily applied to movement data obtained from the wild. But how does this cost of swimming compare to other species? Here's the walrus data plotted against the cost of transport for several other species of marine mammals of different body mass. It might seem that the cost of swimming for the walrus is only slightly higher than predicted for other marine mammals of a similar size. But remember, this is a logarithmic scale. In fact, the cost of moving 1 kilogram of walrus flesh 1 meter by swimming is twice as high in walruses than for other marine mammals. This study highlights the importance of obtaining species-specific data for incorporating into bioenergetic models. In the case of the young walrus in our study, although resting metabolism was strikingly lower than for other marine mammals, the higher costs of swimming suggest a greater potential impact of changing ice conditions on their health and survival. Finally, a big thank you to the training staff at the Vancouver Aquarium for completing the trials despite the tendency of walruses to turn scientific equipment into toys. Further details of this study can be found in the latest edition of Marine Mammal Science, or by contacting me directly for a PDF.